I'd like to start the talk. So we have Vera Molnár relived, and we have Marlow Moss relived. These are the two experts, and we'll hear what they have to say, and I'm sure they'll answer any question you need at the end. Thank you.
Hello everybody, my name's Lucy Howarth. Thank you so much for coming and for your interest in Marlow Moss and Vera Molnár. And this is Francesca.
Yes, my name is Francesca Franco, and really happy to be here and to see you all here.
Yes, it's really a wonderful thing to see Marlow Moss's work up on the wall. This is actually the first time that Moss works have been for sale in this way in a gallery in London, in an exhibition. I mean, she's been included and been on the wall in commercial galleries in London over the years, but this is the first time there's been a kind of build exhibition of Marlow Moss in a gallery such as this in London since 1958, the year she died. So I have the catalogue of that show here with me. Whoops. It was at the Hanover Gallery. So yes, this is an auspicious occasion indeed. Yes, I'm very, very happy to be here with Marlow Moss and Vera Molnár as well. And so Francesca and I are going to I'm going to say a little bit about Moss first, and then hand over to Francesca, and then we're going to ask each other some questions and discuss the connections between these two artists. Marlow Moss was a British artist, a constructivist. She worked alongside Mondrian in Paris. Between the wars, she was a founder member of Abstraction Création in Paris, alongside Georges Fonteneleu and Jean Gorin and Mondrian himself. And her name is not as known as their names, and that is something that is gradually changing, and she is becoming more recognised and more celebrated. And I kind of want to stop short of talking about her work as a precursor to Vera Molnár's work. I feel like that's a kind of dangerous avenue to go. You know, there is connections between their work, but Marlow Moss wasn't anticipating computer art. But there is connections, and I think the connections are most clear in these works we have here through their drawings. They both made paintings and they both made sculpture. But I think it's in the drawings that we can see that Moss was a conceptual artist and a constructivist, and that connects very much to Vera Molnár. Shall I hand over to you?
Well, with Vera, she was born about 30 years after Moss, and she's a pioneer of computer art. She was born in Hungary, in Budapest, in 1924. She was inspired by the Constructivist tradition, by abstraction, and once she started having the opportunity to see the computer for the first time in the 60s, she started to experiment with that. So she took the lesson of constructivism and she took it further. Personally, I started to get to know her work as a PhD student here in London over 20 years ago. And then I was able to, when I started curating exhibitions years later, I invited her to be one of the artists, and since then we collaborated on new projects, new commissions, so our work relationship kind of veered into a friendship and a collaboration. So I'm really, really happy to see some of the works here, and some were exhibited recently in an exhibition that we curated together in Rome. And I'm really interested to know more about Moss's work, because I'm not familiar with her work, and I can actually see some connections, and I would be really happy to discuss that.
I think it's really interesting that their working lives do cross over. So when Vera Molnár started making abstract paintings, she was, I think it's that in the mid-40s, and she was in Paris.
Yes.
And so by that point, Moss wasn't in Paris anymore. She left, she had moved out of Paris, and she lived in Normandy, and then she was actually in the Netherlands when the war started, at her partner's home in Zeeland in the Netherlands. And so she then came back to England. She had a lonely and isolated time at the beginning of the war until Nettie Neuhoff, her partner, could join her, and then she didn't return to Paris. She didn't return to her home in France. It had been bombed during the war. But she was making work all this time. So in the 40s, when Vera Molnár was in Paris, Marlow Moss's work was being exhibited in Paris. She was in shows with the Salon de Réalité Nouvelle in Paris, certainly in 1946, and other years. So there's a chance Vera Molnár could have seen Marlow Moss's work. But then I think what's so interesting about, because Marlow Moss died in 1958, so despite Mondrian encouraging her to go to New York, she didn't. She stayed in Cornwall, and spent time in the Netherlands. But she died in 1958, the year of her final show at the Hanover Gallery. Whereas Vera Molnár continued on for so much longer, had such a longer life, and she died last year.
Yeah,
So
she moved in Paris in 1946, and then since then she lived and worked there. She was very good friend with Sonia Delaunay and Max Bill, so I wonder if they maybe...
Well, Max Bill is certainly a connection. Moss was friends with Max Bill.
So they might have met.
Yes, I mean, he's obviously younger than Moss, so
Yeah.
it's a sort of next generation, but Moss refers to Max Bill as a young painter she knows, or a young artist she knows, when she's writing a letter to Garbo, which is in the Tate archives. So she certainly knew Max Bill. I think she had a lot in common with Max Bill. Has my microphone gone off? Or? No, okay, sorry. I've lost my thread now.
Well, actually, that gives me the opportunity to ask you one question. So, how did you get to know her work? Moss.
Yes, okay. I first heard of Moss as the female British Mondrian, and that was just such an intriguing way to describe her, and it's since become the kind of bane of my life, because I find myself still saying this every time anybody asks me about Marlow Moss. I go back to this female British Mondrian, and I want to talk about Moss apart from Mondrian, really. I mean, I think this work, there is maybe a connection you can see, especially work around the corner is maybe Mondrian-esque, but I think this work really demonstrates how she's not just a follower of Mondrian, which is how she's been described again and again. But anyway, this is how I heard of her, the female British Mondrian. And so I mean, this was back in 2003, I think, and I think Googled her, and it's impossible to imagine now, but I couldn't find anything. There was nothing on the internet back then. And I think I looked her up in my kind of dictionary of art and artists, and there was no Marlow Moss, and so I thought maybe I'd misheard the name, because I thought, surely this is so interesting. There must be writing about this artist, and I went back and found the person who he did become my supervisor for my PhD, Sam Smiles, and asked him, what was that name? Who were you talking about, the female British Mondrian? And he gave me a little book by a Dutch artist called Florette Dijkstra, and that was kind of the starting point of my research. Was Florette's research project of 10 years previously in the 90s. Florette made reconstructions of the lost works of Marlow Moss, and I contacted Florette and I went to visit her, and I was busily establishing that nobody else was researching Marlow Moss, because I thought, well, this is such a plum project, this is amazing, this ticks all my kind of interest areas in constructivist art, and it's an unknown artist, it's a PhD, it's kind of possibly writing itself. I mean, it turns out it didn't write itself. And it's actually quite hard when there's not much information out there on an artist. You're trying to find archival material. I was told again and again, oh, there's no work. It was all destroyed in the war. You won't find anything. There's no information. And I did find work. I found work I was kind of blessed, I think. I found work on the walls in galleries in London, Jonathan Clark and Offa Waterman. I kind of stumbled across a few Marlow Moss works. I went down to St Ives. I went to Lamorna, where Moss lived. I spoke to people in the pub in Lamorna, and they directed me to the people in the village who remembered Moss. And so I started my project really kind of in that way, and gradually I found more and more information, and there is work. There's work in the Tate collection, there's work in the Leeds collection, there's work in the MoMA in New York, in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, there's works in all the major collections in the Netherlands. So I was gradually kind of pulling together, a big body of work, and there is there's more work, post-war work than the early work. The early work is kind of few and far between. But I did find a lot of information in the end. And
you couldn't interview her, though.
No, I mean, that's a really big difference, I think, is that you knew Vera Molnár. I didn't know Moss, I don't know Moss, and I am very kind of aware of that. I feel this kind of weight of responsibility of representing an artist who is gone and can't speak for themselves, and I don't pretend to know Moss in that way personally, but you really did know Vera Molnár, so that's a whole different type of responsibility you have.
Yeah, totally different. And I wonder how these two different experiences shape the history of contemporary art, and how we write about the artists that we like and we are passionate about. I've been working with Vera even on new projects, so I could see how she would approach creativity in a very practical way, and probably this is the difference between her and Moss, because when I approached Vera 10 years ago, she was already kind of known in a niche field, in computer art circles, but she hasn't been acknowledged by big institutions, so it was great to have the opportunity to introduce her to the Venice Biennale, for example, which is what we did 2 years ago with this new commission, and also to work on something new, like new materials. She was very excited to try like glass, starting from very, very old concepts, like concepts that were they were shown already here in 1974 in these early plotter drawings. So I think it's a different approach to writing art history.
How did you first meet Vera Molnár then?
I met her in Paris as a student. I interviewed her because I was really interested in her work and understanding. I mean, the difference in working with artists, living artists, is the fact that you can approach them directly. You could even email them and they answer.
Well, not always.
No, always. My very, very first background is in Renaissance art.
So, really? Oh, that's interesting.
So when I started thinking about computer applications in the history of art, and I realized that there was a history about this, I was really amazed by the fact that in this case, I could talk to the artist. And
of course, Renaissance art relies a lot on mathematics and planning and geometry and composition as well.
Absolutely.
So it's not so different.
No. I mean, to me, it felt absolutely like in line with my research. But having the opportunity to work with Vera directly was a big step and a big learning experience. So it was fascinating to talk to her and to see how she approached the materiality of her work and all the influences that she had.
Well, I wanted to ask you about this work particularly, which is a homage to Mondrian.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really beautiful connection. I think Mondrian is a ghost in the room.
Yes,
with
yeah,
both
absolutely.
of these artists. So I mean, could you tell us a little about that work?
This is one of the early plotter drawings that she made in Paris. It's a homage to Mondrian, and as I was telling you earlier on, she got in touch with the Constructivist tradition when she moved to Paris in 1946, and she actually she used to work with her husband, another artist turned into a scientist, and they used to play with black sellotape at home, trying to recreate the lines of Mondrian's paintings. So it's really interesting to see that after 30 years from those days, she recreated these lines using a plotter drawing machine. And it's really interesting to see this work in dialogue with Moss's work, and I think line is one of the elements that brings these work together. Probably, I'm sure you can say a lot.
I think artists like Vera Molnár and Marlow Moss, that what they saw in Mondrian was the same thing, maybe, and maybe it's not something Mondrian himself put there, because he didn't. If you look at the drawings around the corner here, you can see the way Moss works, and she plans a composition, and there's lots of little mathematical workings out, and that's complete anathema to Mondrian. That's not. Thank you. It's not how Mondrian worked. Mondrian was a painter, and he worked on the canvas, and he moved lines around on the canvas, whereas Moss planned everything in stages. There's a system to her work. It's the way that the works are installed here. There's kind of 3 sections of work. So this is geometrical drawings, which are complete works of art. You can tell because they've often got a pencil frame around them. They're signed and dated, and Moss obviously considered them to be complete works of art in their own right, so very different from the works around the corner, which are clearly preparatory drawings for paintings. And then the third group of works, entirely different again, and they're a really, really interesting set of works that are this free-form drawing, taking a line for a walk. Possibly they're all dated, or the ones that are dated are all dated 1950, and I kind of wonder if they were all done in one afternoon, a kind of mad afternoon. But they're actually they're spontaneous. They're not as they're very different from these drawings, but I can see a connection between them and Moss's sculptures in the same way as I can see a connection between these drawings and Moss's sculptures. So I think they're all very much part of the same idea. So Moss was a constructivist and a conceptual artist, I would argue. So it's different ways of getting at the idea. She wasn't necessarily concerned with the material form of her work. She was just pursuing the idea. So I wonder what she would have made of Vera Molnár's approach. I think she would have understood it and comprehended it, because she too worked to a system, and she was, when she was planning her composition, she had little cut out squares and rectangles of colour that she would be moving around, and I think that's that seems to make a connection with Molnár's approach.
Absolutely, yeah. And all these works are from the 70s, probably all created in the same crazy afternoon.
Okay, yes.
And most of them are based on one concept, which was very dear to Vera, that of chaos and order. So trying to find a balance between them.
Yes, I mean, that's very much a chaos and order.
Yeah. She loved starting from a very simple concept, like a grid, like in this case. Usually it was like a grid of 10 by 10 squares. And then she added an element of distortion, in this case, a horizontal distortion, that made, in this case, some trapezoids shapes that she loved. She found that the trapezoid was even like a very funny shape that made a square her favorite shape.
So she described it as funny, did she?
When she talked to me, yes. Yeah. She was like, because we worked on a new iteration of this work in glass in Venice, and we were making all these 100 trapezes in glass, and she told me this anecdote that she loved.
I mean, I love that, because there's sculptures by Marlow Moss that I find humorous. I think there's a humour in them, and I've often tried to find a way to kind of describe that or write about it, because it's sometimes people mistake this kind of work as being very austere, but I think it's kind of full of humour.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Vera had a really dry sense of humour, and when she described these trapezoids, she was smiling, thinking that they are like squares that move. So she could see this kind of dynamic aspect of it, and she loved it. So it's a very simple idea, but it's something that she carried on for her whole career. This kind of movement starting from errors or distortions that she added to a very logical structure of a grid. Even in those squares, like individual squares at the end. You can actually see this movement of these concentric squares that are all, I mean, you can see that there is a sort of distortion applied to them. And she was really, I mean, she loved surprises, and she loved to be surprised by her work.
Do they relate to sound at all? They seem to kind of have a reverb kind of...
To me, there's a huge influence of music and rhythm in her work. And when I asked her, I mean, some works, they even start from a series of variations. And sometimes, I mean, once I asked her, I can see music in these works, and she smiled at me because it was something that connected really deeply with her. Like she loved Bach and the mathematical order behind these works. She loved Mozart. She created compositions based on the numbers sung by Figaro in the opening scene of the marriage of Figaro. So there is definitely an influence of music in her work. Was it the same with...
Well, I'm just flicking through my notes here, because I have a quote from Moss. She didn't write a lot about her work, and I never met her. So the few words I have from Moss that describe her work are really precious to me. I'll just read. So this was in a little exhibition catalogue from the Ara Gallery, which was a little gallery in Mousehole in Cornwall, near where Moss was living in 1949. And the show was of drawings and constructions. Moss very much put her drawings together with her sculptures and these kind of relief constructions, like this very interesting, unique drawing in the middle there, made with montage. But she wrote, and it's reproduced in the catalogue, I would like to ask the public to look at the work as free as possible from preconceived ideas on art. These drawings are constructed on a very simple principle, a geometrical figure, sometimes broken, sometimes cut, sometimes divided, sometimes subdivided, until the relations of the lines to each other produce an aesthetic emotion. And then she goes on, if one considers the lines in these drawings as sounds, note or chord progressions, and geometrical figure as the musical key, one can, to a certain extent, compare these drawings to music.
That's really cool.
Yeah,
That's really cool.
That's certainly a connection that she's making.
Oh, that's great.
So did Molnár agree with you when you?
Yes,
So
yeah,
she's,
yeah. And I think what was really interesting talking to her was to know how she was always surprised by her own creativity, and she would tell me that what keeps her wanting to learn more is to wake up in the morning, make herself a tea, and then take a pencil and start drawing and think about what if. So what if I do this, or what if I do that? So she always had this element of surprise and curiosity in her work, and that included a variety of areas like music, for example, sounds, visual, images.
And did she consider these to be complete works in themselves, or were they in any way preparatory for paintings or for bigger works?
That's a really interesting question, because she loved these works as final works, but somehow they kind of gave her the idea of exploring them into other forms. Like, for example, this series was then made a year later into a canvas, acrylic in canvas, 1 meter by 1, and then 50 years later it became a glass work. So she was really happy to experiment using different materials. What about Moss? Was she considering her works?
I mean, I think it's really, really interesting to speculate how Moss, might have worked with new materials and new methods. To me, it's really clear that she would be interested. I think she would have been interested in computers. I think she included a lot of mathematics. You can see all her mathematical annotations, but I don't think she was necessarily a great mathematician. So if she'd found a tool that could allow her to expand the mathematical possibilities of a composition, I'm sure she would use it. Absolutely. But then I'm going into that dangerous territory that I always try and avoid of supposition and of kind of imposing back onto a 21st century idea back onto a 20th century artist, and that's something that I always feel is to be avoided. I mean, it's difficult to avoid it, because obviously I am a 21st century person and I am looking back at her work, but I'm always very wary of doing that, of making assumptions about what her motivations were, especially when there's so little direct writing from Moss.
Yeah. It's funny actually to see that drawing with the annotations, because it reminds me some of Vera's notebooks, which are her most treasured possession, more than the actual final works. And I could see some common signs, even in the way she numbered the squares. And
I'm always so fascinated by the preparatory drawings. It shows the workings of Moss's thought process, and I really love the finished works as well, but I think there's something so fascinating about seeing the working process of an artist. And I can often connect. So the drawing that's round the corner there, that's got the blue on it. I recognise the arrangement of the yellow square and the black rectangle. And if you look at it carefully, you can see there's a big cross through the blue rectangle, and as soon as I noticed that, I thought, I know which painting this is. This is a painting that was at auction 10 years ago or something. It's in a private collection now, but it's that composition with the black and the yellow, and it's got the double line. This is a very important feature of Moss's work. It's got those double lines. You can see them faintly on that drawing, but in the finished painting, they're two big black lines, and it's such a thrill when I can kind of make those connections and kind of track her thinking from a drawing to the finished work. Yeah. But yes, I do really like the preparatory drawings in themselves.
I've been tempted to recreate one of Vera's works from her sketches, and I don't know if you would be able to do it with. Yes,
I mean, I think it's a really interesting idea, that because with any with art of this kind, it doesn't necessarily rely on the touch of the artist's hand, and so yes, there's nothing inauthentic about recreating. Possibly, I have tried to recreate Moss works at different times to try and work out if I can track, if I can locate the mathematics or the geometry, or is the Fibonacci sequence being used? And then I thought, well, this is just kind of code breaking. I'm not really interested in cracking the code in that way, but it's certainly an interesting thing to explore. I'm just looking at what I was going to talk about. This set of, they're not quite automatic drawings, but they're kind of free-form drawings at the back here. I only recently saw them in a couple of years ago. Was the first time I actually saw them in the flesh. Before that, I had been aware of them. I'd seen footage on a VHS tape of these amazing, strange, different drawings, and so I think it's been very, very interesting to see them for the first time in the flesh a couple of years ago, and then now to see them up on the wall as complete works. So that's something that I really wanted to kind of underline, that they're so kind of unusual and precious, really.
Did you notice any change in the way her work is perceived after your exhibitions at the Tate, and after her work was actually acknowledged by bigger institutions? Yeah,
I mean, I think the interest has never let up in Moss. Since I went from the beginnings of my research, where there seemed to be nothing and no information and just discouragement from anyone I spoke to, and that gradually transformed into interest, and now I have institutions contacting me quite regularly, and private collectors as well. So I think the interest is increasing.
Is there any misconception about her work that you noticed?
I constantly am pushing against the follower of Mondrian, but that's something that's been there from the start with her work.
That's interesting.
Is there something that you're thinking of particularly?
No. I'm just thinking about Vera and how there was a misconception about the way she used computers. It was perceived as very cold, very rational. While instead she found it very warm and human, the way she used it. So I was wondering if there was something similar in Moss.
Yeah, I think that's possibly a part of the reason that Moss hasn't been particularly celebrated in this country, because I think British tastes are maybe more towards figurative art and the landscape, and maybe kind of sort of a romantic sensibility more. She is more celebrated in the Netherlands. I think it's she's clearly a European artist rather than a British artist. I mean, there's all these different reasons why Moss kind of fell between the stools and wasn't celebrated for all sorts of different reasons. When she came back to England at the start of the Second World War, Mondrian told her to contact Ben Nicholson and recommended that she should, and she wrote to Ben Nicholson and he ignored her. We know this because he did in fact keep the letters, so the letters are now in the Tate archives, so credit to Ben Nicholson for keeping this record. But there's 3 letters, and by the final letter it's clear that, I think the first letter says, our mutual friend Mondrian has recommended I contact you. I'm very keen to connect to the abstract artists in England and to arrange an exhibition. She's all about getting on with business, and there's absolute tumbleweed. And then the following letter, which is a year later, she says, perhaps you didn't get my letter, and by the 3rd letter there has been a response because it's a much shorter letter, and she just kind of thanks him for his response, and she gives up really. I think there's various reasons for that mismatch, but I think it is a misunderstanding of not just Marlow Moss's work, but of constructivism in this country. I think that's a bigger issue than just Marlow Moss.
Yeah. You see various reasons. Which reasons you think
for various reasons.
Lifestyle. Her lifestyle was. They talk about a lot now.
Well, I think there's a lot of interest in Moss now from a gender point of view, she was clearly dressed in a masculine style, and that's the way she appeared in not just in these amazing photographs that are by Stephen Nehov, who's the son of Nettie Nehov, but also in everyday life. She wore these clothes in Lamorna. Some of the people I met in Lamorna who were children were still a little unsure. They called her Miss Moss, but they weren't that sure, possibly. But then the confusion was deeper than that. They thought, I spoke to one person in Lamorna who insisted that she was foreign. And I said, well, no, she was English. She was born in London. But they said, no, she had a foreign accent. And I don't know how much of that is just kind of misremembering, or just that she was just so strange that she must have been foreign, I think. Or possibly she'd picked up a kind of trans-European accent. But I think, it's hard not to think that that's part of Nicholson's prejudice against her. I think she's been left out of art history because she's a woman, and also because she's not quite a woman enough, in some ways. So she's kind of left out on both counts. And I'm using female pronouns for Moss, as she did in her own lifetime and as her partner did. But of course, gender-neutral pronouns weren't an option for her. That wasn't there for her. So if she was alive now, again, this supposition thing, she may have chosen to identify as trans. She may not. I think it's a unstable ground to make assumptions. But I think she is now referred to as they and them in a lot of discourse, which is a new kind of discourse to talk about Moss. But I think it's she would have recognised it. She would connect to it. She must do. But I don't know. Does that answer your question? Yeah. I can't remember. The different reasons. She was in the wrong place at the wrong time a lot as well. I
think Nicholson just had a trip.
Yeah, he was busy. He'd stopped being a constructivist and started painting landscapes. I guess he just didn't like her. She was a bit older than him. She knew Mondrian more than he did. I don't know. Maybe he was just busy. I don't know. It's it's when I did the show at Tate St Ives, I was so keen to, address this and have those letters from Nicholson that I knew were in the Tate archives. But I thought, will they let me do that in Tate St Ives? Is that? And then they did. They were very keen to do that. So those letters were the kind of central part of the display, really. But then I kind of wanted to move away from that sad story in a way. That's not the only story about Moss. Just her neglect and her kind of rejection. So I don't know. Was Vera Molnár left out of?
Well, in the 60s, I think access to computers was mostly directed to engineers and scientists, and there was a majority of male scientists at that time. So I think she was kind of marginalized a bit, but I think she found a way to get hold of a computer and to work with one of the first.
Yes, how did she have access to a computer in the 60s?
Yes,
so very early.
Yes. Yeah. So she went to the Sorbonne. She was looking for a way to apply randomness to her compositions, and she was really lucky to find one computer at the Sorbonne that she could use.
And what did it look like? Was it as big as a room?
Yeah, and she wasn't even able to see the results of her computation on a screen, because at that time there were no screens. So once screens became available, she got super excited because she could see all the results of her calculations immediately in front of her without waiting days after, punching cards, and so she was able to access those machines and to experiment with them from the very beginning. She learned Fortran, she learned BASIC by herself, and so in that sense she was not really she didn't have too many obstacles in that. But I noticed that there was a later recognition of her work, especially from bigger institutions. So it could have been about female versus male opportunities. But I'm really happy that I brought her to Venice for the Biennale when she was 98. She was still alive, and it was her first time there. So she was the oldest artist participating for the first time at the Biennale, and she was really happy about that. So at least probably having the opportunity to live for so long gave her more opportunities compared to Moss.
And if she was still alive now, if she's still working now, do you think she'd be interested in AI?
I think she was really interested in everything new. She made her first NFT at 98.
Right.
So it was just something that triggered her creativity. So she was really, really interested in anything new and something to explore. So I think she would have been really interested in the developments of AI in art. What about Moss?
I mean, I should think anyone who's interested in kind of art and creativity is interested in this discussion. It's definitely the discussion of our age.
I think Vera, though, always used the computer and the idea of technology as a tool, almost as a slave for her creativity. So she never felt like dependent too much on the machine. So she wanted to have a final say on, for example, the selection of works coming out of the machine.
Yeah, I'm interested in I love the way that they're this sort of printout paper. But so these works up here, the squares, they're all unique. They're not just print-offs. you know, because you might mistake them as, if it's computer art, you know, maybe it's just like hit print, but they're all unique, original works of art that are one-offs, and that's really interesting, isn't it? Because it's, I mean, there obviously is a kind of repetition, and there is with Moss as well. There's this drawing here is, I think, identical to this one here, but this one is smaller and has a square frame around it. This is kind of free floating, but these and then this drawing with montage here is exactly the same composition as a drawing that I only know from an archival photograph. So, you know, Moss was repeating, you know, did repeat the same design or the same composition, the same idea, and it's fascinating to kind of think, you know, what's going on there. I mean, you could actually see the process happening, so you've got a bit more insight into, you know, what was Molnár doing when she did slight variations of a composition.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many connections, and it's really beautiful to see all these works together. I wasn't familiar with Moss's work, but it's so fascinating to see all these connections. And what is also interesting is the fact that, yes, there's a machine involved in this, but calculation and the structural order behind these works is more important to Vera than the actual use of the machine. So in that probably...
Well, I mean, Moss used a ruler and a compass. You know, these are machines, you know, these are tools as well. So.
And this is exactly the concept of computational art that has to deal with numbers and computation more than the use of the latest machines. So I think this is something that really brings all these works together. And Christine has something to say.
Has anybody ever tried to do 3D printing from either Vera Molnár's?
Oh my goodness! Yes.
It'd be interesting with some of these geometrical drawings of Marlow Moss to see how it.
Well, one of Moss's sculptures has been reproduced after her, subsequent to her death, in a kind of a sort of plastic. So that has happened. I mean, and it could be 3D printed. I mean, I think that's a marvelous idea. Again, I think all of these things would be really legitimate steps forward.
Because I remember once being in Oldenburg's studio, and he just sent a drawing up to a 3D printer.
Yeah.
It was amazing, you know, a two-dimensional object suddenly became three-dimensional. So I just wonder, you know, this one, you could imagine, particularly, you could imagine it becoming a sphere.
Yes, I mean, she's literally doing it herself with this, there is a two-dimensional drawing of this composition, and then there's now this three-dimensional montage version. So, yes, I mean, absolutely.
There's a piece in the middle one here with the square, with the lines that distort of the concentric squares. I've done 3D printing in clay before. When I first saw that image, it was the first thing I thought of. It was like 3D printing in clay, when the clay oozes out the sides, and it's absolutely identical to the feel you get when you're 3D printing the clay. It's fascinating to see. I think James brought it up.
I'd love to see the work.
In the Marlow Moss show at the Haus Konstruktiv in Zürich, there were a number of abstract collages. Now, did she do that before the war or after the war? Because we know that Mondrian, when he went to New York for the movie, all this is actually made by collaging the, you know, there are very few actual paintings, they're all placed on and moved around. And I just wondered if they both knew they were doing that.
That's a very interesting question. Yes, I mean, I know that she was doing it after the war, but I don't know if she was doing it before the war. Nettie Neuhoff describes Moss's kind of working method in the 1962 Stedelijk Museum catalogue. There was a big show at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam in 1962, and that essay by her partner Nettie Nijhoff really gives us, an awful lot of information, but it is after Moss's death, and so she gives a description of her working process, going from thumbnail sketches and just little dabs of colour, or and those little collage that I know you're referring to.
Identify
Yes.
the paintings from the collages. Did her girlfriend ever spend much time in Cornwall, or?
She was in Cornwall, yes.
They lived together.
Yes. She joined her in Lamorna after the war, and then they spent time on Nijhoff's houseboat in The Hague, and but she was in Cornwall as well. Yes.
When did you start making your first sculptures?
They were, as far as I know, a post-war development. But that's there may be work I don't know about that's earlier than that. But
Reconstruction is what? 40. Is it the 40s or the?
It's 45.
It's 45.
So was that the start of going 3D?
Yeah.
No, there is earlier white reliefs of the 30s. Yes, yes. That's and she was making those in the Netherlands, and so that started in the 30s. Those reliefs, but I think the sculpture started in Cornwall, as far as I know. I mean, there's some sculptures that are only known from archival photographs, and I really know very little about them really. I was just looking at Lydia Clark works just this afternoon before I came here, and there's so many connections there, but I don't know if there's a literal connection, but there certainly is aesthetically. But there's still works that I don't know much about, that I just know from photographs.
But they're in the famous Haus.
Famous Haus. It was a really question. I was just getting really interested in between maths and systems, because down the screen here there's a do maths but there's this desire and this intrigue in systems, but it's really intuitive. It's not it's not mathematical. I'm also interested, James, who actually knows songs that says yellow, black and blue squares and not squares. I'm just thinking but that made me laugh because there's rectangles, lots of that. But anyway,
Jess finds it funny too. So.
And I also thought it was so lovely what you both said about working through the respective artist systems in your head in a way of getting closer to the artist, which I found really poignant. I know many figurative painters who paint rather than paint as a method for almost getting closer to what they were trying to do, and I thought that was I think that was very poignant, especially when you know the artist and when you not know the artist, and a way it's understanding what's going through their brain, and it's not a question, but it's just also the other things of computer art. It's so obvious what you said, but I never look at it. Computer these days, we think screen, and the fact that these don't like screen, and it's just so it really is about the concept and the system, and your way of getting close to the artist by working that through, and always like the happy accident of what the end visual result is.
That's actually the reason why I don't like particularly the word computer art, but I prefer computational art, because it's more, it includes just... Yeah. Yeah. And for example, Vera, I mean, she was not really using computers if her concept didn't require that kind of computation. So she loves the fact that the computer would give her millions of variations out of one algorithm. But if she had to do 1 + 1, she would just use one. You know, she wouldn't use.
About sound and movement, and I was thinking this is early animations, you know, which was happening, you know, that these what look like the stop motion in a way as well. So which is a whole other outreach. No, it's fascinating.
I wonder if you could both say something about depth, because obviously almost everything in the room is flat. And I absolutely accept that they both made three-dimensional things, but what we can see is flat. But it's just about impossible to make a flat work without, up to a point, evoking depth in some way. So lines tend to suggest perspective. These trapezoids in particular, of course, could be conceived as rectangles in depth. So I wonder, given that they were both absolutely, you know, resolutely sticking with the surface area and making marks on a flat surface, I'd just be really interested to hear anything either of you had to say about your artist's attitude to the other dimension.
When I think about Vera's work, I always think about flat surfaces, for example, and also her abstraction. I think about the fact that it started from realistic images, like sometimes from trees that become circles and lines, and they become flat. So I wouldn't see a depth in her search for abstraction, for example. But I do see depth in the works, like in these, in the work that we've done in the sculpture in glass, because we had to literally make holes in, like 100 holes in a thick plate of glass. So there is depth for sure. But in her search for abstraction, I would see something very like concepts that become, the results are super flat. So I wouldn't see that as a major preoccupation for her. But again, this is just like me talking about her work. And
that's so interesting that she abstracted from nature. You know, again, like Mondrian. I mean, that's not like Moss at all. In that way, Moss isn't an abstract artist. In the dichotomy of abstraction création, that really set things up as two kind of opposing approaches to non-figurative art. And Moss is very much on the creation side, the constructivist side. So not abstracting from nature, but building up from a system or from mathematics or from an idea. Moss was seeking space, movement, and light. That's how Nettie Nayhoff characterized her. The kind of aim of her work was space, movement, and light. So I think there is space in them. They aren't flat. They are three-dimensional. Sometimes in the relief works, which have kind of ropes, then one rope is passing in front of another, and then so that's literally that is behind that in a kind of perspective. But even then, she tampers with that by using ropes and cords of different thicknesses. So they kind of, there's always a play. I think there is always, something coming forward and something going backward, and that is definitely the case. I think you're right with those diagonal lines, which appear in various forms. Certainly got a feeling of perspectival space. And I think she was interested in that.
Is Vera Molnár consider herself a minimal artist?
If she considers herself,
Well, that's interesting. So that's a term we've not touched on because I don't use that in relation to Moss. But it could be.
She loved minimalism. She loved simplicity, and to extract the minimal lines out of very complex images, for example. I don't know if she was very keen on labels in general, so I don't know if she would have loved to be called a minimalist.
It's like the start of the 70s.
Yeah, that's true.
It's all you speak, you wonder.
It's a very good question.
Did Moss have exhibitions in Paris before the war?
Yes, she was involved in groups in Paris, and she participated in group shows with Association 1940 and Abstraction Création and various other. Her work was included in lots of group exhibitions. She didn't have solo shows until after the war.
Did she sell work then? I mean, how did she make a living?
She definitely sold some work. She sold a work to ARP at some point. I know that from a letter. I don't think she sold a lot of works. She had her own private income. She had family money that allowed her to live in Paris.
She wasn't cut off then by her family.
Oh no, that's actually, we're talking about misunderstandings. I think that's a story that's been told about Moss, and it's maybe slightly down to Nettie Nahov and her predilection for a romantic kind of hero's journey story, that she was estranged from her family, and she wasn't estranged from her family. She received her income from her family. She was in touch with her sisters. She's one of 4 sisters. I mean, maybe she did move away from her roots, but she wasn't estranged from her family, no. I think that's a misconception. It's part of a good romantic narrative.
The movie.
Yes.
Another question about composition, if I may. Moss's work, the way that the objects, the graphic objects, occupy the space seems to belong very much to a Western Renaissance compositional tradition, whereas Molnár's work, in some ways, particularly with the ones just behind you, there's a strong suggestion of Japanese composition in the way that the marks occupy the paper. So I wondered if you had anything to say about either of those traditions, either the Western perspective tradition or other traditions of using space.
This is the hardest question I've ever heard.
Sorry.
Thank you, Stephen. I invited you here.
Is there a Japanese connection?
Japanese connection. I
And
never
influence?
thought about that. I never asked that question to Vera. She traveled a lot with her husband when he was teaching in the States, but I don't think that she went east. I think the eastern probably was Venice, where she was later. And the reason why some of her works are called icon from that tradition. But I don't know if she was really inspired by...
Well, I suppose another way of seeing Molnár's work is that each rectangle could just be a sample of something.
So it's like an all-over composition, like in the way that
just happened to see.
Yeah, like a Jackson Pollock or something. Yeah, so Moss's work they're very much a figure and a ground, aren't they?
It's a finite little world
Yes.
that's been constructed, isn't it?
Yes. But then I think sometimes with her paintings, I mean, this isn't the full story that we have here with some of Moss's paintings. I think and with Mondrian's actually, and Leger's, they imply a kind of continuation beyond the canvas. And Moss, like Mondrian, sometimes worked on a square as a lozenge, so that again kind of implies a movement out. And I think that's something Moss was really interested in, like creating a kind of movement out from the composition into space,
Well, I'm sorry about the question.
No, I'm not thinking. Actually, there is some. No, there must have been some connection because of the love for non-symmetrical images. So the fact that when she applied randomness to all these compositions, she sort of found the right. She selected some of the images when they kind of clicked with her, and there was some sort of unusual asymmetry to that. So I don't know if that's kind of a tiny link with that culture. But yeah, I will think about that more. And yeah, thank you for that.
Okay.
I find the sort of the sets, the ones done as a 5 pieces, one does make one look at sort of different states of Picasso or Rembrandt. And it's fascinating being able to see them as a row and see what comes in, what goes out. I think it's fascinating. I haven't actually, when you said, I've never actually counted, it's 8 by 8.
Yes, this is, yeah. There's also a series of 10 by 10, then 12 by 12. Yeah.
But as a series, keeping to the 8 by 8 is extraordinary.
I have a question about the use of color. And this might relate back to the question of depth that we were addressing before. Because in Hegel's aesthetics, he talks about how painting reduces the image to a flat surface, to 2 dimensions, which is different from like architecture and sculpture. And in this particular page, he talks about how the color in painting is what gives dimensionality to the painting. So I was wondering if in Moss drawings and works we can think of color to have this same role, to use.
I don't think Moss uses colour in that way. I think she uses colour conceptually and not, she's not kind of using it to give us a feeling of aerial perspective or anything like that, or kind of anything representational about, light hitting an object or atmosphere. I think, she uses colour as in a much more kind of conceptual way. I mean, that's how I think about it. It's interesting, in her painting, she does stick to Mondrian's red, yellow and blue, but in these drawings, there's often green. And I'm not quite sure what that means, but I feel like it's used in a conceptual way and to denote the shape, I feel. Is that answering your question, or is that
curiosity about the use of colors.
Yeah. That's an interesting question. I'm thinking about.
Are the glass pieces, are those in colour?
They are in 24-karat gold leaf.
Wow.
Excuse me.
Wow.
so I'll say yeah, me too.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for having us.
Thank you for having us, and thank you everyone.
Give you a